First, I want to thank TFI and Larry for having me here, and really I love listening to all the presentations because they really do inform my research. You know, some of these things are quite technical, but when I hear explanations of things, it really does help me because so much of my research relates to artificial intelligence and machine learning and different aspects like that. So most of my research really hinges on the areas where law has not kept up with technology or changes in society. And in the United States right now, we're kind of in an interesting spot. A couple people mentioned about China winning the 5G race. Well, they're also winning the artificial intelligence race. But the way I look at it is, in the US, we have very slipshod laws. Our laws are very narrowly focused, and we really don't know what to do about data. And data is really what underlies all of these technologies, especially machine learning, because we really aren't able to develop artificial intelligence or Internet of Things unless we have lots of data available to us. So on the one spectrum, you have European laws, which protect very strongly citizens' rights to their data. And on the other side, you have China, for instance, where the government has access to most data. So before I talk about data, I want to talk a little bit about why the laws are the way they are in the US.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I remember well your first visit to Capitol Hill back in 2010. You spoke to the Senate Republican High-Tech Task Force, which I chair. You said back then that Facebook would always be free. Is that still your objective?
Senator, yes. There will always be a version of Facebook that is free. It is our mission to try to help connect everyone around the world and to bring the world closer together. In order to do that, we believe that we need to offer a service that everyone can afford, and we're committed to doing that.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see.
Okay. So if you watch the hearings, which most people did, what you may have noticed is that the senators asked a lot of very ignorant questions. And that is why we have laws that do not make sense. We have a lack of knowledge of technology in government. And this is really hampering us in the US. Orrin Hatch, he's the chair of the Republican High-Tech Senate Task Force. His job is to help companies innovate. He does not know how Facebook works. So we do have laws. They are very industry specific. We also have laws that are at the federal level and at the state level. And companies trying to comply with them have a lot of difficulties because they're so specific, sometimes they don't know if they apply to them or not. You may be aware that we have banking privacy laws, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. And this provides significant protection for your financial data that's held by the bank. But what if I told you that for 3 months in 2015, your bank on its homepage had a button, and anyone could go click on this button, enter information about you, and the bank would automatically send them all your bank statements as far back as they could go? What do you think would happen to that bank? Well, under Graham-Leach-Bliley, there'd be significant repercussions. They could be liable to you for the data breach, they could lose their charter, they could pay a fine, but absolutely nothing happened. And the reason is because it wasn't a bank, it was the IRS. And there's absolutely no consequences to them. There's 3 governing boards that audit them for their security and privacy measures, but there's no enforcement of anything because these types of audits are just to issue reports to tell them what they're doing wrong. In fact, the IRS did not encrypt your data until 2017. So my title is called The IRS and the Data Mess. And this is based on a series of papers that I wrote regarding the IRS and its data mining activities. And again, when I look at this, I tend to look at the bigger picture. What are other countries doing about this? What should we do about this? But what I've noticed is Congress seems very focused on what private industry is doing with our data. You hear about behavioral advertising, how we have no control over our data, but what you don't hear about is what the government is doing with our data. And what they're doing with our data presents a lot more significant risk than what Amazon is doing, for example. Now, when Amazon does its data analytics and recommends a book to you, you may not like it. And that's your risk with using these types of analytics. But when you have the government using predictive analytics, you have situations like in Wisconsin, where the Wisconsin Supreme Court indicated that using predictive analytics was permitted for sentencing despite evidence that showed that their analytics incorporated data that was shown to represent historical discrimination. Now, you may be wondering, so why did the IRS get into this? How did this all happen? Well, it happened in 2011. You had the Affordable Care Act, you had the new FATCA rules, but at the same time, you had a lot of attrition in the IRS office and you had significant budget cuts. So they had all these additional responsibilities and not enough people to really carry out what they were supposed to do. So what they decided to do is turn to analytics because computers could do more than the individuals could do in the IRS. So let's see if I can find it. All right, so right here, Office of Compliance Analytics was created in 2011, and then in 2016, it was merged into the Office of Research Analytics and Taxpayer Advocacy. Now, this data mining activity is very questionable for a number of reasons, but it's been reported that they are actually data mining information from the internet and purchasing potentially information from data brokers, social media sites. Now, we do have laws that apply to government. Now, one of the interesting things is in Europe, they have a main privacy and security law, which is known as GDPR. The GDPR applies to both private and public entities. And what that means is a national or local government in Europe has to comply with the same rules as a private business. There's no difference in the requirements because their focus is on protecting the citizens. In the United States, we split these up. And what that means is that with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, it does not apply to the IRS. There's a completely different set of rules. So one of the issues is we have these very old laws that are trying to be put on top of technologies that didn't exist back when the laws were created. So, for example, the main law that applies to government is called the Privacy Act, and that was created in 1974. And that's the law that we primarily use today to look at this. Now, in 1974, what we had going on was a couple of things. The first one was we had just gone through Watergate. So the public became very concerned, and Congress became very concerned with domestic spying by the government. And they wanted to make sure something like this did not happen again. But what's interesting is at the same time, what was going on was computers were being put into government offices for the first time. And I've read all the Senate hearings over this bill, and it's really kind of fun to read because these people are talking about computers the same way that Elon Musk talks about artificial intelligence. They were very afraid of having these computers in government offices because they did not know exactly what they could do. But this was what was going on when this law was created. So there's about, I'd say, 20 different statutes and laws that I discuss in my paper, but I'm just going to talk about these three so you kind of get a feel for what the government was trying to do, but where it's not succeeding. So we have this Privacy Act of 1974, and the idea was to limit the government's use of data, to put tight controls on it. And one of the things that they did that was really quite innovative at the time was they adopted these FIPS, Fair Information Practices. Now, fair information practices are the foundation of every single privacy law in the world. They've been incorporated in Europe, in Africa, Canada, South America, and here in 1974. The problem is we don't seem to be enforcing them. The idea behind the FIPS is there should be no secret government collection of data. You should be able to review your data. You should be able to correct your data. The data should be kept secure. And most importantly, and this one applies to both business and government, but this is the one that we seem to have let go, there should not be secondary uses of your data. In other words, once data is collected for one purpose, it cannot be used for another purpose unless you provide additional consent. We also have the data minimization rule, and this comes from the Computer Matching and Privacy Protection Act. And the idea behind this is government should not be just amassing tons and tons of data about people. They should only keep data that relates to their mission. So for the IRS, very simply, that would be data relating to your tax return. The Paperwork Reduction Act, which came along, this is one of the newest ones from 1995, requires agencies to make sure that the data that they're using is of quality, meaning it's correct. Now, if you think about it, if they're obtaining information from the internet, social media, data brokers, that type of information is likely to be error-prone. And if anyone has ever been on a dating website, you know what I'm talking about. People put stuff out there that's not true. Also, people put stuff out there about other people that's not true. But when you're gathering data like that, no one is sifting through this to see which statements about you are accurate and which are not. So I discovered this back in, I think, 2012. So I had done a fair amount of research about the cannabis industry. So in Washington, they made recreational marijuana legal, and I had discovered that contrary to what these businesses in Washington thought, they were unable to deduct their business expenses because of Internal Revenue Code Section 280E. And this was something they did not seem to be aware of. But while I was doing this research, I came upon a PowerPoint for a predictive analytics conference by Dean Silverman, who was an advisor to the commission. And when I saw the slide and saw everything he indicated that they were doing, charting and analyzing social media, such as Facebook, tracking individual internet addresses and email patterns, I thought this goes way beyond the mission of the IRS. And that is why I started writing about this, because I was very concerned that this did not seem right. So there's a number of potential harms with the IRS doing that. I list more than just these three, but for brevity's sake, I'll discuss these. First, discrimination. Second, misuse of the audit function. And three, and a really serious risk, is data breaches. If you think about the type of information the IRS has, it's an attractive target for hackers. So let's start with potential discrimination. This one, I have to explain it a little bit. So when you're using predictive analytics, what you're actually doing is you are taking information, large amounts of data, and you're looking for patterns. And once you discover that pattern, you can start looking for attributes that will lead you back to where you began. So let me give the example of you run data from banking records, and you discover that people who tend to pay for things with cash very often, that there is a correlation with people who are non-compliant. They cheat on their taxes. So what that means is the machine says, you know what? We need to find all these people who are paying for things in cash, especially houses, because houses cost a lot of money. So what they do is they start looking for people specifically who pay cash for houses. And you may say, well, what's the problem with that? How is that discrimination? Well, there are some religions that are prohibited from paying interest. So everyone that's a member of that religion that has these attributes would be targeted by the IRS for an audit, and that's discrimination, because we can't choose people based on race or religion to provide them with extra scrutiny. So this is a concern because the way analytics works is correlation, not causation. So just because someone pays for a house with cash does not mean that they exhibit non-compliant behavior. The second issue is that the IRS has a long history of misusing the audit function. And this is done by the executive branch. So Nixon was famous for this. He audited everyone he didn't like. This started back with Roosevelt. This is a very common tactic. Let's get information on our opponents, political opponents. But it's also been done more recently. So if you recall, with the 2012 issue, they were taking these certain political groups who had not-for-profit status and were providing extra review or delaying their ability to be approved. And that was, just so you know, after the Senate hearing, they said this was not politically motivated. But if you think about it, it seems pretty likely that since they were only flagging one political party's not-for-profits, that there was probably some targeting involved. And then data breaches. So data breaches are a big concern because of the type of information that the IRS maintains. So I just put some of the statistics, there's more than this. But with freedom of information requests, people can request information from the IRS. However, in 1/5 of the times that the IRS responds with information, they're actually giving wrong information, other people's tax information. With the get transcript function, which is associated with student financial aid, where you can get your tax return and have all that information put into there, what was happening was they were releasing Social Security numbers to anyone who was asking for them. This was for a short time. We had hackers that were able to obtain 100,000 EPIN numbers and claim fraudulent tax returns. And what we have is the Government Accountability Office doing audits of the IRS every year saying you're not securing your data, you are creating a situation where people can take this information, but every year they were ignoring the recommendations. I think, in 2015, there were 43 security deficiencies found about the IRS, and they didn't correct any for 2016. What I think is that Congress needs to do two things. First, they need to get up to date with technology. They lack the knowledge to understand how technology works and what their laws do and don't do. I also think there needs to be some type of real oversight over the IRS and all government agencies that are collecting data so that, first of all, we know what data sets they're using, what the source is, where they come from, that we know what type of outcomes these analytic processes provide, and that there be some type of consequences if they fail to follow the Privacy Act. And I don't just mean the exact language in there, I mean the spirit of the Privacy Act. Because as I mentioned, the Privacy Act was created in 1974. It doesn't say social media. It doesn't say internet. But clearly the intent was to protect us, not to give the government license to collect whatever it wants. So we really need to think about data. I always come back to this. There's so many things in our future with technology, but the base of them developing has to do with data. So when I do this type of research, I look at law, technology, ethics, social science. My research interests are fairly broad, And there's not a lot of people who do this type of research because with academia, you're rewarded for very narrow research. So you pick one stream and you go with it. That's very difficult for me to do because a lot of times when, even sitting here and I wrote about 10 things I want to research about what you said having to do with law. So I'm working on new things right now. And again, it really ties back, but I'm looking at artificial intelligence and employment decisions. And I don't know if you read a lot about this, but there seems to be this sense that algorithms are discriminatory, artificial intelligence is scary and bad and going to do harmful things. But the truth is really more nuanced than that. But the specific point I make in this paper is that we know humans are biased. And we know humans make inconsistent decisions. And that is why analytics, in conjunction with humans, can come to much more objective conclusions. I do believe China will win the artificial intelligence race. China is throwing money at this like crazy, and the US can't decide what it wants to do yet. The US keeps looking to the European model, and how many of you can name a major tech company out of Europe? There are none. Yeah. If you look at the top 10, 7 are from the US and 3 are from Pacific Asia. If you look at the top 20, again, there's one company that's outside of the United States or Asia Pacific area. So a lot of these things, I know this sounded like a really pessimistic presentation. A lot of these things, I think, come down to let's think about what we want to do with data. Let's think about how we want to regulate data, because I think something needs to be done. But I'd like to see more focus on what the government is doing in conjunction with what private industry is doing. And thank you. Oh, yes.
I have one question.
Yes.
So my daughter applied for insurance under the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
And they tied her social security number back to a private credit reporting agency in order for her to qualify for affordable care, for insurance. And I thought, how in the world can they do that?
How can they utilize, boom, how can they utilize your social security number that you're applying specifically for some kind of governmental program and then use a private credit reporting agency to verify the data or something? I don't know.
Well, with the IRS, they do have contracts with Axiom and Palantir, which provides an incredible amount of very detailed information about us to the government. And that is something else I feel is violative of the Privacy Act. Yes?
Something interesting as to why China is winning the AI race is that they have more data.
Right.
Why have they
volume.
They have more data? Because there's no privacy.
That's right. The government hoovers it up.
So it's like a catch-22, right?
Right.
So we want
You have-
privacy, but we want to win the race.
Right. So we have China on this end, we have the EU on the other end, and we want to fall somewhere in the middle. But yes, that's a good point. Yes?
Should we file our tax returns electronically or mail them in?
That somebody asked me that question before. Filing it electronically does make it a lot easier for them to data mine it. But even if you file it on paper, I did ask one of the field agents I know. They do have people who actually input all the information from your paper return, so I don't think you can get around it that way.
Who's the Senate, for example, that needs to be educated about
Technology or taxes?
the whole area of privacy in the current technology?
It is Orrin Hatch. He's the one that is the chair of the whole committee. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Very interesting.